This mini lecture illustrates the use of participatory mapping in a planning case example from Tanzania. The lecture follows the development of the mapping methodology to its piloting in village land use planning in Tanzania and summarizes findings of a study on the benefits of the methods to the planning process. After this lecture, you will be able to illustrate the use of participatory mapping in a land use planning case example, differentiate planning system from planning and participatory mapping practice, and finally summarize benefits of participatory mapping to planning and to the participants. The case example is from Tanzania in East Africa. Tanzania has enacted several sectoral policies allowing community participation and community rights in resource management since the early 1990s. For example, in forest management, land use planning, land ownership, and wildlife management. Since we focus on land use planning, I talk first a little bit about the land use planning system in Tanzania. Tanzania has 6 administrative levels. They have national, regional, district, ward, village, and sub-village levels. And the land use planning system has 3 levels of land use plans. There is the National Land Use Framework Plan that covers the entire country. Then they have district land use framework plans that cover districts and the administrative areas within it. And then on the lowest level, they have village land use plans that govern the land use of villages and sub-villages. Currently, there are thousands of villages in the country without a land use plan to guide sustainable land and natural resource use, and the government of Tanzania has recognized an urgent need to extend the coverage of district land use plans and village land use plans in the country. Village land use plans are made to direct land use and village development for the next 10 years, after which they can be reviewed if needed. The aim of the village land use plan is to support sustainable land and resource use, and especially mitigate and solve land conflicts, which are quite common in Tanzanian villages, and also promote social and economic development in rural areas. The national legislation for decentralized planning and management give the village councils the mandate to prepare village land use plans. And the guidelines for the village land use planning practice highlight participatory approach to achieve this. The role of the district planning officers thus is only to facilitate the planning activities on the ground, while the village council has the responsibility to prepare, implement and revise the VLUP. Then the village assembly, meaning all the village inhabitants over the age of 18, has the right to comment and approve the village land use plan in the end. The current village land use planning and mapping practice is based on classroom setting, where the district planning officers are asking the community representatives mostly questions, and there's very little interaction among the community members. During the process, they do participatory mapping, and it's done as mind maps on blank pieces of paper, such as this example here on the right. And these mind maps are difficult to digitize and combine with other spatial data. There is very little, if any, reliable ground reference points on these maps. And so they collect using GPS devices ground reference points in the village, which is very laborious and impossible to do comprehensively throughout the village. And thus, in the end, there's very little spatial information collected during the process to inform the land use planning decisions. With the known limitations of the current planning practice in mind, our Finnish and Tanzanian research team started to co-develop a participatory mapping methodology for village land use planning process and study its implications. First, in 2015, I, as a PhD student at the time, interviewed and held workshops with Tanzanian district planners to study the current practice in Southern Highlands area. In 2016, with our Tanzanian colleagues, we co-developed the mapping method and tested it in one case study village during official village land use planning process. Then, through observations, interviews, and group discussions, I studied the usability of the method and its implications to spatial data quality, environmental learning, and deliberative decision making. The village land use planning process takes normally 12 to 16 days per village, and it includes various activities shown in the flowchart on the right. We co-develop methods for different phases of the planning process, shown here in orange color. I will not go now into the details of all the methods, but if you are interested, you can study the flowchart on your own and also check out a practitioner's manual on the methods that I will introduce to you soon. I will go into details of the participatory mapping methods later on in the lecture. Overall, our aim for the method improvement was to involve community representatives more actively in the planning activities. Important was also early engagement of the community representatives in the process, awareness raising on the village land use planning and its objectives in the community, and also that the tools are cost effective and simple. Our second aim for the method development was to improve spatial data availability and quality. And this is very important in Tanzania, since Tanzania does not yet have advanced production, sharing, and maintenance of spatial data, especially at village level. And this is in comparison to Finland, for example, where we have several sources of spatial data available to planners and open data available to average citizens. In Tanzania, the spatial data mostly exists only on district and higher level scales. At the village level, the only available spatial data are the village boundary maps, as well as topographic maps from the 1960s and 70s with roads, rivers, control lines, and some landmarks shown in it. But these are oftentimes completely outdated. There are several efforts in the country to create joint repositories of spatial data, for example, at the Land Ministry and other ministries, but in reality, systematic mapping at village level and remote sensing technologies require resources, including skilled experts, which are not always available. So that's why participatory mapping with local community members and satellite image interpretation are oftentimes the only ways to collect information about the villages. As I mentioned, the entire methodology is documented in a practitioner's manual, which we published in 2018 with the National Land Use Planning Commission of Tanzania. The manual has step-by-step instructions for district and other practitioners on how to use the methods, and you can access the manual through the link in this slide. As a side note, apart from the pilot study we did, the methodology has been used and adapted so far in over 30 villages in Tanzania, so it seems that the methodology is helpful to planners so that they are interested in adapting it. The co-developed participatory mapping method is based on the use of printout satellite image of the village as a mapping background. The participants to the mapping exercises are selected by the village assembly, and they represent various social groups in the village. The method involves the following mapping exercises. So the committee representatives verify the village boundaries by drawing them on the satellite image. Then they use the satellite image to map the current land uses in the village. And then finally, they use the current land use map and the satellite image to negotiate and draw the future land use allocations in the village. The current land use mapping can also be done in smaller groups where, for example, women and men sketch their own maps and then, through discussion, combine them into a single map that everyone agrees. In the end, the current and future land use maps on the satellite image are presented to the village assembly for them to review and discuss them, and then ask for modifications and finally approve them. The village satellite image is printed in scale 1 to 7,500, and it allows, for example, individual houses and even trees to be seen in the image. The preparation and use of the satellite image was designed to be as simple as possible. The district planners prepare the images using open access GIS software and data and print them on multiple sheets of A0 that are combined into one using transparent tape. Then they use transparent plastic sheet on top of the image for villagers to draw on using marker pens that are erasable. In the Tanzanian village land use planning process, the mapped information follows the national planning system standards and includes land use areas and water sources as polygons and social services as point data. In the left side, you can see an example of a village land use plan and the land use categories that are mapped into it. In the right side, you see what the sketch maps looks like after the community has made it before it is digitized. What's important to remember is that the mapping is done collectively, and so the areas shown in the maps are relevant to the entire community collectively. In the future land use map, changes to the land use areas and services are marked with dashed lines in the sketch maps. After the sketch maps are finished, they are photographed from the zenith position, and the photos are imported to GIS software, where the photos are georectified and the maps digitized into digital versions of the maps by the district planners. Also, GPS tracking is performed with the community members in areas and places that were not clearly visible on the satellite image, and these GPS points are used to complete the digital maps. In the end, the maps are printed and returned to the communities for the villagers to use them in guiding land use. Next, I will shortly summarize the benefits of the participatory mapping method that can be identified through the pilot study, comparison of the village land use maps, and interviews with the Tanzanian planners and mapping participants. When comparing village land use maps that have been done without satellite image and maps that have been done with satellite image, it can be shown that with satellite image one can achieve spatial information that is more detailed, precise, and standardized. In the left, you can see visual comparison of 4,000 meters times 4,000 meters snapshots from village land use maps. Above are 4 snapshots of maps that have been produced without satellite image, and below 4 maps that have been produced with satellite image. You can observe that the maps with satellite image show more fine-grained land use pattern and organic form than the maps above. On the right side is a comparison of 26 maps that were produced without satellite image and 16 maps that were produced with satellite image. In the table, you can see that the average number of mapped features in the maps done with satellite image is more than double compared to maps done without satellite image. The same observation can be said about the average number of mapped land use categories and mapped land use areas per land use category in a village. This indicates that the mapping with satellite image results in more detailed capture of land use information on the maps. The satellite image has been shown to support land dispute mitigation and resolution. On the left, you can see part of a satellite image of a village where the method allowed villagers to map their village boundary more correctly. On the image, the red dashed line shows the village boundary in a village boundary map that was done without the use of satellite image. The yellow dashed line, on the other hand, shows the village boundary when the satellite image was used with the villagers. This example highlights the importance of achieving more precise and more accurate official land use maps of the villages. The photo on the right is from a village where the satellite image was used to solve a village boundary dispute between two villages. The representatives of the two villages were able to discuss and reach an agreement about the boundary without having to track the boundary on the ground, which in the past had been done to try to solve the dispute. Through observations and interviews and group discussions with participants and district planners, a number of benefits to inclusiveness and spatial understanding and learning can be identified. The use of satellite image activates people with different social status, such as women and elderly who normally do not engage in discussions so much. The image also acts as a visual aid to express opinions and makes the exercise also fun. The participants also learn about their village land uses and get to better understand the entire village through the satellite image. In fact, 73% of people who were interviewed say that they learned something new about their village environment through the satellite image. One participant, for example, said, and I quote, "The satellite image has widened my understanding of the village, such as boundaries, sources of water, and uncultivated land." And another person said that the satellite image allowed me to know the whole village. I'm a disabled person, so I cannot move around the whole village. The satellite image in that sense gives a bird's eye view perspective into the village, which people normally do not have, and which is a huge advantage in understanding the village landscape. The use of the satellite image was also shown to have influence on discussions during spatial decision making. The satellite image supports discussion as a boundary object, meaning that it creates shared language among the participants and also translates meaning among the various land users when people are using the satellite image to express views to each other. 91% of the people who were interviewed say that the satellite image eases discussion and makes it more detailed. One participant said, and I quote, "The satellite image made the discussion easier because we could look at everything we were discussing on it." Another person said, "I have learned during the exercise that everyone has their own perspective to contribute into the discussion." And so the participatory mapping supports deliberation, including consideration of needs and values of different land users. And the satellite image increases transparency of decisions when the impacts of decisions can be seen on the satellite image and thus more clearly on the ground. Despite the many benefits of using satellite images in participatory mapping, there are limitations in the method also. For example, not all participants interacted with the image and engaged in the discussions, while all interviewed participants knew how to read and use the image. They still didn't actively engage in the activities. It's clear that the satellite image and mapping method are not intrinsically inclusive, and the use of satellite image may actually hinder engagement and alienate participants. 41% of the interviewed participants mentioned that they had initially either fear of difficulty or difficulties in understanding and using the satellite image. And one participant mentioned of his observation when he said that some people did not voice their opinion because they did not understand the satellite image. Another limitation is that the geospatial technologies and data such as satellite data and printers are not accessible to the communities and not even to all the districts in Tanzania. And this undermines the local ownership of the land use planning process. There also exists still very limited information on biodiversity values and conservation needs, and this is information that local community members do not necessarily possess, and so different ways needs to be developed to access this information so that the conservation needs are more taken into account during land use planning processes. And finally, future scenarios and alternative futures are not explored during the mapping process and planning process. The plans are not future-oriented, but focus on addressing most urgent needs and interests. And so the plans do not prepare the village to capitalize on future opportunities or mitigate future risks in the long term. If you're interested in reading more about the participatory mapping methodology that I have introduced to you in this lecture and the experiences in Tanzania with this method, you'll find information in the practitioner's manual that I mentioned earlier and in the article published in Landscape and Urban Planning that you can access through the link in this slide, and also in my PhD dissertation that is accessible through the link on this slide.